groan of the wheels sinking into the half-frozen mud was the first sound of Silver Creek that truly registered in Ella Lanina Morgan's ears. For 6 long days, the world had been a blur of rumbling wood, the smell of horsehide, and the ceaseless chatter of her fellow passengers' chatter she had mostly ignored, her mind fixed on the destination. Now, the coach had lurched to its final stop, and the silence that followed was heavy with expectation. Her expectation. Inside her worn wool coat, her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She clutched the small, leather-bound reticule in her lap, the paper-thin edges of a half-dozen letters tucked safely inside. Their words were practically memorized, etched into her soul over the past 6 months. Words of warmth and intelligence, of a shared longing for companionship against the harsh loneliness of the frontier. Words written by Mr. William Prescott. He had described Silver Creek as a place of rugged beginnings, a town carving its existence from the dense pine forests and the unforgiving mountains that loomed like silent, gray giants in the distance. He had described himself as a man of simple means but strong conviction, a merchant looking to build a future and a family. In his last letter, he had written the words that had spurred her journey across 2 territories. I feel as though I know your spirit, Miss Morgan. It is a spirit as strong and forthright as I have ever encountered. Come to Silver Creek. Come be my wife. Taking a deep breath that tasted of pine and impending snow, Ella waited as the coach door was unlatched, a blast of cold. Sharp air filled the cramped space, one by one. The other passengers descended a stout drummer with a case of tinware, a family with 3 small children whose faces were smudged with dirt and jam, and a quiet, elderly woman. Then it was her turn. As she placed her foot on the iron step, she instinctively straightened to her full height. It was a habit she'd never been able to break, a movement as natural as breathing. 6 feet tall. In the East, it had made her an oddity, a subject of whispers and poorly concealed stares. But William's letters had never once asked about her appearance. He had been taken with her words, her thoughts on literature and farming, her steady, clear penmanship. He had fallen in love with her mind. Surely a man of such substance would not care about something as trivial as stature. Her worn leather boots met the muddy ground. She scanned the small crowd gathered near the newly built stagecoach station, a simple structure of raw, unpainted timber that still smelled of sap. There were miners in mud-caked trousers, a few women in plain calico dresses with shawls pulled tight against the cold, their faces weary from work and worry. And then she saw him. He matched the modest description he'd given her, a man of medium height with a clean-shaven face that was pleasant but not particularly strong, his sandy hair peeking out from under the brim of a respectable town hat. He was holding a single, slightly wilted wildflower. Her heart gave a painful lurch of joy and relief. It was him. It was real. She took a step forward, a smile forming on her lips, ready to say his name. But then his eyes, which had been scanning the descending passengers with a look of eager anticipation, landed on her, and they stopped. The hopeful expression on his face did not just fade. It collapsed. It was as if a light had been abruptly snuffed out. His eyes widened slightly, and he took an involuntary step back, a small, almost imperceptible movement that felt to Ella like a physical blow. His gaze traveled up, from the hem of her travel-worn dress, past her waist, her shoulders, and finally to her face, which was now level with his own, and then slightly above. The color drained from his cheeks. The wildflower in his hand trembled. He knew who she was. Her valise, a sturdy but old thing, was being handed down from the top of the coach. The tag bearing her name was plain to see. The small crowd, sensing a drama unfolding, grew quiet. The whispers died. The only sounds were the snorting of the tired horses and the sighing of the wind through the pines. Ella felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, not as a newcomer, but as a spectacle. William Prescott cleared his throat and took a hesitant step forward, his movement stiff and unnatural. He stopped a good 10 feet from her, a chasm of cold air and shattered dreams between them. "Miss Morgan," he asked, his voice thin and reedy, a pale imitation of the confident tone in his letters. I am William Prescott." "Mr. Prescott," she managed to say, her own voice sounding foreign and distant. Her smile had frozen and died on her face. "It is a relief to finally arrive." "Yes, indeed," he stammered, his eyes darting away from her face, fixing on some point over her shoulder. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't meet her gaze. There seems to have been a significant misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. The words hung in the frigid air, sharp and cruel as shards of ice. A misunderstanding was a misread date, a misplaced address. It was not this. This was a visceral, public rejection. "I don't understand," she said, though she understood perfectly. The truth was crashing down on her with the weight of a mountain. "Your letters," he began, then faltered. They painted a picture of a delicate constitution. "Your prose is so refined." Asterisk delicate. Asterisk. He had chosen that word. He had read her accounts of helping her father run their small, failing farm after her mother passed, of mending fences and tending to livestock, and he had concluded she was asterisk delicate asterisk because she could spell correctly and her sentences were properly formed. Her valise landed on the ground beside her with a soft thud. The driver, a man with a face like tanned leather, tipped his hat and moved away, eager to be free of the suffocating awkwardness of the scene. William gestured vaguely with the wilting flower. I had envisioned someone different. He finally forced himself to look at her, a fleeting, panicked glance. "I am a man of modest proportions. Miss Morgan, a wife should be—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. A wife should be smaller. A wife should be someone he could look down upon, literally and figuratively. A wife should fit into the neat, tidy picture he had constructed in his mind. Ella felt a coldness spread through her that had nothing to do with the wind. It was a deep, internal freeze, starting in her chest and creeping out to her fingertips. The warmth of his letters, the hope that had sustained her for months, turned to ash. "I see," she said, her voice quiet but perfectly steady. Her pride, that stubborn, resilient thing, was the only thing holding her upright. She would not cry, not here, not in front of them. "Then I apologize for the misunderstanding." He looked relieved, pathetically so. "Yeah, well, I am sorry for your long journey. Perhaps the stage back east." He let the sentence trail off, an offer that was also a dismissal. He gave a short, jerky nod, dropped the sad little flower into the mud, and turned. He walked away quickly, without a backward glance, melting back into the crowd that now parted for him, their whispers starting up again like the rustling of dry leaves. Ella stood alone. The valise at her feet contained everything she owned in the world. The letters in her reticule felt like stones, heavy with the weight of lies. Not his lies, but her own foolish, desperate belief in them. Asterisk, I thought I was chosen for who I was. The thought screamed in her mind, a silent, agonizing cry. Asterisk. But it turns out he only chose a vision in a letter, a small, delicate ghost made of ink and paper. She could feel the stares of the townspeople burning into her back. The giant woman, the mail-order bride who wasn't wanted. Her humiliation was complete. She had two choices: stand there and endure their pity and scorn, or walk. She chose to walk. Bending down, her back straight, she picked up the handle of her valise. It felt impossibly heavy. She did not look at the faces in the crowd. She focused on the muddy street ahead, a wretched ribbon of brown cutting through the town. She put one foot in front of the other, her steps measured and deliberate. She would not run. She walked past the general store, its windows filled with sacks of flour and bolts of cloth. She walked past the saloon, from which the tinny sound of a piano and a burst of rough laughter spilled out into the street. She walked past the blacksmith shop, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil a steady, indifferent heartbeat. Every building, every person, felt like a judge and jury. She had no destination. She was simply moving away from the point of her undoing, a slow retreat into anonymity. The town of Silver Creek, which had existed in her mind as a haven of hope, was now a prison of shame. She had to get out of their sight. Her path led her back toward the stagecoach station. The coach was already being unhitched. The tired horses led away toward the livery. She didn't want to ask about the next coach east. She couldn't bear the thought of the station agent's knowing eyes. Instead, she rounded the corner of the building, seeking the relative shelter of its rear wall. Here, out of the main thoroughfare, the wind was less sharp, and the chorus of whispers was fainter. She leaned against the rough-sawn planks, the wood biting into her back through her coat. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the full weight of what had happened settle upon her. She was alone, in a strange town, with barely enough money to book passage back to a home that no longer felt like hers. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her. "Ma'am." The voice was low and calm. It came from her left, from the deep shadows where the station met the adjoining livery stable. It held no pity, no mockery, no curiosity. It was just a word. Ella's eyes snapped open. She turned her head, her body tense, expecting another gawker, another whisper. A man was detaching himself from the shadows. He was tall, taller than her by a few inches, his frame broad and solid under a worn sheepskin coat. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see the dark stubble on his jaw and the steadiness of his gaze. He wasn't staring at her height. He was simply looking at her, as one person looks at another. He took a slow step forward, his movements easy and unhurried. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes dark and unreadable, meeting hers without flinching. "You left this," he said, his voice a low rumble. He held out his hand. In his large, gloved palm rested the small, wilted wildflower William had dropped in the mud. Ella stared at the soiled flower lying in his open palm. A pathetic, trampled thing, its petals bruised and smeared with the filth of the street. It was an emblem of her humiliation, a testament to the beautiful idea that had died just moments ago. A bitter taste rose in her throat. "No, thank you," she said, her voice low and tight. "I have no use for it." The man's gaze didn't waver. He held her eyes for a moment longer, a flicker of something unreadable in their dark depths, not pity, but perhaps understanding. Without a word, he closed his fingers over the flower, turned his hand, and let it fall back into the mud from whence it came. The gesture was simple, final. He had offered, she had refused, and the matter was closed. He straightened up, his height even more pronounced now that he was closer. He was one of the few men she had ever met whom she had to slightly tilt her head back to look at fully. The realization was so novel it was momentarily distracting. "The stage east doesn't leave until Friday," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a fact, delivered in that same calm, rumbling voice. "That's 2 days from now. Town's not a place to be without a roof, especially with snow in the air." He gestured with a slight nod of his head back toward the main street. "Martha Webb runs a boarding house. It's clean, and she's fair. You can get a room there." Ella's defenses, which had been breached and left in ruins, began to hastily reassemble themselves. Every stranger was a threat, every offer of help a potential trapdoor into more shame. I'm not sure I can afford." "She takes work and trade if coin is short," he cut in smoothly, anticipating her protest. "She's always in need of a hand with mending or laundry. She'll see you're a hard worker." He said it with such certainty, as if he could read her entire life story of toil in the set of her shoulders and the calluses on her hands. The strangest thing was, she didn't feel inspected or judged. She felt seen. "Why would you?" she began, the question hanging unfinished between them. Why would you help me? Why do you care, asterisk? He seemed to consider this for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the darkening sky, where heavy gray clouds were gathering over the jagged peaks of the mountains. No one should have to stand in the cold, he said finally, as if that were the only explanation required. He bent down in one fluid motion and picked up her heavy valise before she could protest. The bag, which had felt like it was filled with lead to her, looked like a small satchel in his grip. "This way," he said, and started walking. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He simply trusted that she would, and after a moment of stunned hesitation, her mind warring with a lifetime of caution, Ella did. She fell into step a few paces behind him, a tall, silent woman following a taller, silent man through a town that had already cast her out. The walk was excruciating. Word had clearly spread. Faces appeared in windows. Curtains were pulled back. Men standing on the boardwalk of the saloon stopped their conversations to watch them pass. Their eyes crawled over her, and she could feel the heat of their stares like a physical touch. She saw the smirks, the nudges, the whispered comments. The story was already forming. The town's newest piece of gossip, the giant mail-order bride. Rejected at the station, now being led away by the reclusive Gabriel Blackwood. She knew his name because she'd heard a pair of women muttering it as they passed. Blackwood, one had hissed to the other. What's he doing with asterisk her asterisk? So, he was Gabriel Blackwood, and he, too, was apparently a subject of some note. He seemed utterly oblivious to the attention they were attracting. He walked with a long, ground-eating stride, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't acknowledge the whispers or the stares. His complete indifference became a shield for her. If he did not care what they thought, perhaps she could pretend she didn't either. She lifted her chin a fraction of an inch and focused on the wide expanse of his back, using it to block out the prying eyes of Silver Creek. The boarding house stood at the far end of the main street, a sturdy two-story building made of dark, weathered timber. It looked more like a home than a business, with a wide front porch and glass windows that glowed with the warm, yellow light of oil lamps. A simple, hand-painted sign read, "Mrs. Webb's Room and Board. Clean beds, fair rates." Gabriel Blackwood mounted the 3 steps to the porch and set her valise down. He didn't knock, but simply pushed the heavy wooden door open, letting a wave of warm air, thick with the scent of roasted meat and baking bread, wash over them. He held the door and waited for her to enter. The common room was large and sparsely furnished, but immaculately clean. A long dining table, scrubbed to a pale pine, was surrounded by a dozen mismatched chairs. In the corner, a large cast-iron stove radiated a comforting, bone-deep warmth. A woman with graying hair pulled into a tight, severe bun and a starched white apron tied around her ample waist looked up from the pot she was stirring on the stove. Her face was a roadmap of hard years and harder work, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Gabriel," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Wipe your feet. I just swept this floor." "Martha?" he acknowledged with a nod, dutifully scraping the mud from his boots on the coarse mat inside the door. He then looked toward Ella. "This is Miss Morgan. She'll be needing a room." Martha Webb's sharp eyes moved to Ella. She took in her height, her travel-worn clothes, the exhaustion and humiliation that Ella was sure were written plainly on her face. There was a brief, assessing pause, a silence that stretched for an eternity. Ella braced herself for a question, a comment, a look of pity. She received none of them. "Got the small room at the back of the stairs free," Martha said, turning back to her pot and giving it a vigorous stir. $3 a week for the room. Meals are extra. Pay in advance." The practicality of the woman's tone was like a splash of cold, clean water. There was no sentiment, no gossip, just business. Ella clutched her reticule. "I can pay for one night." Martha nodded, not looking up. "One night it is. Gabriel, show her the room. Supper's in an hour. If you're eating, "Miss Morgan, it's 50 cents." Gabriel picked up the valise again and led her up a narrow, steep staircase. The room was just as Martha had described it: small. It contained little more than a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small washstand with a basin and pitcher, a single straight-backed chair, and a wooden peg on the wall for her coat. But the floor was clean. The air didn't smell of damp or decay, and a small, grimy window looked out not onto the main street, but onto the dark, silent forest that pressed in on the back of the house. It felt like a sanctuary. "The necessary is at the end of the hall downstairs," Gabriel said, placing her valise on the floor by the bed. "If you need anything, just ask Martha. She's not as fearsome as she sounds." He lingered at the door for a moment, his large frame nearly filling the opening. She expected him to say something more, to ask what had happened, to offer some word of condolence. He did not. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone, his footsteps heavy and sure on the wooden stairs. Alone. Ella sank onto the edge of the bed. The springs creaked in protest. She ran a hand over the rough texture of the quilt. For the first time since stepping off that coach, she felt the prick of tears behind her eyes. But they were not just tears of shame. They were complicated tears of exhaustion, of confusion, and a tiny, fragile sliver of relief. After a long while, drawn by the persistent, comforting smells from downstairs, she washed her face with the icy water from the pitcher and went back down. The other boarders, mostly miners and loggers, were starting to gather at the long table, their voices low and rough. Ella felt their eyes on her as she entered, but no one spoke to her directly. She took a seat at the very end of the table, hoping to be invisible. Gabriel Blackwood was not at the table. He was sitting in a sturdy armchair near the heat of the stove, a place of honor in the cold room. Another, identical chair sat empty across from it. Ella ate her supper in silence, focusing on the simple, hearty stew and the dense, dark bread. It was the first real food she'd had in days, and it warmed her from the inside out. When she was finished, she paid Martha her 50 cents and, feeling adrift, she hesitated by the door, unsure whether to retreat to the cold solitude of her room or endure the scrutiny of the common area. It was then that she saw Gabriel move. He bent over, and with a soft grunt of effort, began to unlace his heavy, mud-caked boots. He pulled one off, then the other, the leather sighing as it came free. He set them neatly side by side on the stone hearth, a good distance from the heat but close enough to dry. The act was so mundane, so ordinary, yet she watched, mesmerized. He had brought the filth of the outside world in with him, but now he was setting it aside. In his stockinged feet, he walked to the stove, poured 2 mugs of steaming black coffee from the pot that sat perpetually warming on its surface, and returned to his chair. He set one mug on the small table beside him, and the other on the table next to the empty chair. He did not look at her. He did not beckon her over. He promised nothing. He just took off his muddy boots, set them by the door, and then sat near the fire with a mug of coffee waiting. Slowly, hesitantly, Ella moved away from the main table and walked toward the warmth of the stove. She sank into the empty armchair, the old wood groaning softly. She wrapped her cold fingers around the warm ceramic of the mug. He still said nothing, just stared into the mesmerizing orange glow of the fire through the stove's small grate. And so they sat, in a silence that was more comforting than any words he could have spoken. The wind began to howl outside, rattling the window panes, a lonely, mournful sound that usually filled her with a sense of dread. But tonight, wrapped in the warmth of the stove, the quiet presence of the man beside her a silent bulwark against the world. She didn't feel afraid, for the first time in many, many months. Ella Morgan listened to the wind's lonely cry and felt, if not safe, then at least anchored. The morning arrived with a pale, unforgiving light that filtered through the grimy window pane. For a few blissful seconds upon waking, Ella forgot where she was. The familiar weight of dread was absent, replaced by the memory of warmth and a quiet, shared silence by the fire. Then, the cold floorboards beneath her feet and the unfamiliar scent of pine and old dust brought it all rushing back. Silver Creek, William Prescott, the stairs. Her money would last for this one night, and then she would be precisely where she had been yesterday, alone and adrift. She dressed quickly, her movements precise and economical. Pride was a poor substitute for a meal, but it was all she had. She would not be found cowering in her room. She braided her long, dark hair into a severe but tidy coronet, splashed her face with the freezing water from the pitcher, and descended the stairs to face the day. Martha Webb was already in the common room, a whirlwind of formidable energy. She was kneading a mountain of dough on a floured section of the main table, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing sinewy, powerful forearms. She acknowledged Ella's presence with a curt nod. "Coffee's on the stove," she said without breaking the rhythm of her work. "Breakfast is porridge. It's included in the price of the room." Ella poured herself a mug of the scalding, bitter coffee. She took a sip, the heat a welcome shock to her system. She knew she had to speak now. Before her courage failed her, she set the mug down and faced the older woman. "Mrs. Webb," she began, her voice clearer than she expected. "Mr. Blackwood mentioned you sometimes take work in trade for room and board." Martha stopped kneading and looked at Ella, her eyes sharp and appraising over the mound of dough. She wiped a dusting of flour from her cheek with the back of her hand. "Sometimes? Depends on the work. And the worker. I've no time for layabouts." "I am not a layabout," Ella stated simply. "I am a seamstress. My mother taught me. I can mend, darn, tailor, and embroider. My stitches are small and strong. I can make a buttonhole that will outlast the shirt it's on." She delivered the words like a tradesman presenting his credentials. There was no plea in her voice, only a statement of capability. For a long moment, Martha was silent, her gaze unwavering. She was sizing Ella up, not just her height, but the steel in her spine, the steadiness in her eyes. "There's mending," Martha said at last, a concession in her tone. "Always mending. The men in those woods tear through their clothes like they're made of paper. My own linens are a disgrace." She gestured with her chin toward a small, unused table in the corner by the front window. "You can set up there. We'll try it for a week. You work, you have your room and your meals. You slack, you're on the next stage east. Agreed." "Agreed," Ella said, a wave of profound relief washing over her. "Thank you, Mrs. Webb." "Don't thank me yet," Martha grunted, turning back to her dough with a renewed ferocity. "Just prove me right." And so, Ella's new life began in a small corner of a boarding house common room. Martha provided her with a basket of torn clothes and worn-out linens, a spool of sturdy black thread, and a case of needles. Ella unpacked her own small sewing kit from her valise, her silver thimble, worn smooth from years of use, a fine pair of scissors, and a small, precious collection of different colored threads. She sat at the table by the window, the cool morning light falling over her work. The first item was a work shirt belonging to one of the loggers. The sleeve had been nearly torn from the shoulder, a gaping wound in the rough woolen fabric. Ella threaded her needle. The simple, familiar motion was grounding. The world outside her small workspace could whisper and stare, but here, she was in control. The needle was an extension of her will. Her focus narrowed to the point where steel met cloth. Her stitches were tiny, even, and impossibly strong. She didn't just close the tear, she reinforced it, weaving the thread in a pattern that would distribute the strain. It was slow, meticulous work. An hour passed, then another. The common room began to fill with the sounds of the boarders coming and going, their heavy boots clomping on the floor. She felt their eyes on her, the curiosity, the pity. The whispers started, just as she knew they would. A child, pointing a grubby finger from behind his mother's skirts, said loudly, "Mama, why's that lady so big?" The mother shushed him. but not before the words had sliced through the quiet room. Ella's back stiffened, but her hands never faltered. Her needle continued its steady, rhythmic dance plunge. Pull. Tighten. Soon, the nickname began to circulate, carried on the currents of town gossip that flowed in and out of the boarding house. She was the giant seamstress. It was rarely said to her face, but she heard it, a low hum of judgment that followed her everywhere. She was a curiosity, the woman too tall to be wed, now sewing for her supper in Martha Webb's window. She did not bow her head. When someone stared too long, she would pause, look up, and meet their gaze with a cool, neutral expression until they looked away, flustered. She was a rock in the stream of their scorn, and slowly, the nature of their attention began to change. Curiosity began to be tinged with something else. Her first real customer, besides Martha's boarders, was a miner's wife named Sarah Peterson. She was a thin, harried-looking woman who came in clutching a Sunday dress of faded blue calico. "Mrs. Webb said you were doing sewing," she said, her eyes darting around nervously, avoiding Ella's face. "My Thomas, he's had a good week at the claim. I was hoping, could this be let out a bit after the last baby? Well," she trailed off, a faint blush on her cheeks. "Of course," Ella said, taking the dress. Her large, capable hands smoothed the worn fabric. "The seams here have enough allowance. I can give you another 2 inches through the bodice. It will be ready by Saturday." "Mrs. Peterson finally looked at her, and her eyes widened slightly as she took in Ella's full height. But then she saw the dress held in Ella's hands, the way she examined the stitching with a professional eye, the need for a good seamstress, a rare commodity in a town like Silver Creek, was stronger than the urge to gossip. "Thank you," she said, a note of genuine gratitude in her voice. When the woman returned on Saturday, the dress was transformed. The new seams were invisible. The fit was perfect. Mrs. Peterson turned in front of the small, warped mirror in the common room, a look of pure delight on her face. She paid Ella in coin, real money that Ella accepted with a quiet nod of thanks. Word of her skill began to spread. The needle was the only weapon she had, and every stitch became a sign that she still existed proudly. Soon, more women came. They brought torn aprons, children's clothes that needed patching, dresses that needed altering. They came tentatively at first, drawn by need, but they left impressed by her meticulous work. The men came too, gruff loggers and miners who would stand awkwardly by her table, holding out a torn jacket or a shirt missing a button, mumbling their requests. She treated them all with the same quiet, formal courtesy. Through it all, Gabriel Blackwood remained a silent, steady presence. He would come in from his work logging, she presumed, from the scent of pine and sawdust that clung to him, eat his meal in silence, and sit by the fire. He never commented on her growing pile of work. He never offered a word of encouragement. But sometimes, when her lamp began to burn low as she worked late into the evening, she would look up to find he had placed a freshly filled lamp on her table without a word. On the coldest nights, he would add an extra log to the stove before heading up to his room, ensuring the common room stayed warm for her just a little while longer. These small, unspoken gestures were more valuable to her than any compliment. He wasn't trying to save her. He was simply acknowledging her fight. One afternoon, the door opened and a gust of cold air announced the arrival of 2 young women, the daughters of the town's general store owner. They were dressed in fine wool, their faces alight with poorly concealed mischief. They approached her table, one of them holding out a ribbon. "Excuse me," the first one said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "My ribbon has come undone from my bonnet. Could you possibly stitch it back on for me?" It was a pretense, and they all knew it. It was a job a child could do. They had come to gawk, to get a closer look at the spectacle. Ella looked from the ribbon to the girl's face. She could see the smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. For a heartbeat, a hot flash of anger surged through her, but she pushed it down, turning it into ice. "Certainly," she said, her voice even. She took the bonnet and the ribbon. With swift, expert movements, she threaded a matching blue thread and stitched the ribbon back into place with a dozen tiny, perfect stitches. It took less than a minute. She handed it back. "That will be 5 cents. The girls were taken aback. They had expected her to be flustered, or perhaps to do it for free. The cool professionalism of the transaction had robbed them of their sport. The first girl fumbled in her reticule, produced the coin, and placed it on the table. They left without another word, their mission a failure. Ella watched them go, her back perfectly straight. She was not just a curiosity anymore. She was the town seamstress. Her corner of the common room was no longer a place of shame, but a place of business. The pile of mending was a testament not to her poverty, but to her industry. She was stitching herself a place in this town, one thread at a time, and as she bent her head back over her work, she realized she wasn't just mending other people's clothes. With every straight seam and every strong knot, she was slowly, carefully, stitching her own fractured pride back together. Weeks bled into a month, and the sharp edges of Ella's arrival in Silver Creek began to wear smooth, not with acceptance, but with the dulling effect of routine. She was a fixture now, a part of the town's landscape, like the tall pine on the edge of the forest that everyone noticed but no longer commented on. Her corner in the boarding house was a hub of quiet industry. The pile of mending was her fortress, the rhythmic dip and pull of her needle a shield against the world. She had her room, her meals, and a small but growing collection of coins in a tin box under her mattress. She had forged a precarious independence. It was Martha Webb who shattered the peace of this routine. "There's a social at the church hall Saturday night," she announced one evening, slamming a loaf of bread onto the table with enough force to make the cutlery jump. "You'll be going." Ella looked up from the waistcoat she was repairing, her needle frozen mid-stitch. "Oh, no, I don't think so. Mrs. Webb, that's not for me." "Nonsense," Martha retorted. "Not missing a beat. It's for everyone. It's for the town. You're a part of this town now, whether you like it or not. People are bringing pies. You'll bring one." The idea of walking into a room full of the very people whose whispers had followed her for weeks sent a jolt of pure dread through her. A social, a place for families, for courting couples, for laughter and easy conversation, all things that felt alien to her. I wouldn't know what to do." "You'll stand there and be seen," Martha said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You're a businesswoman, Miss Morgan. It's bad for business to look like a hermit. Besides," she added, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, "you made that fine green wool dress for Mrs. Peterson. I know you set aside enough of the same cloth for yourself. It's a sin to let good wool go to waste sitting in a valise." Martha had her there. Ella had indeed made a dress for herself, working on it late at night after the mending was done. It was her one indulgence. A simple gown of dark forest green, perfectly tailored to her own tall frame. It was a statement, a piece of armor forged from cloth and thread. The thought of wearing it in public was both terrifying and exhilarating. And so, on Saturday night, Ella found herself standing before the warped mirror in her room, dressed in the green wool. The fit was perfect. It didn't try to hide her height, it accentuated it. The long, clean lines making her look not just tall, but stately. Her hair was braided into its usual neat coronet, a stark but elegant frame for her face. She looked respectable. She looked strong, but inside, she was a quivering mess of nerves. She walked to the church hall with Martha, who carried a large apple pie that filled the cold night air with the scent of cinnamon. The hall was a blaze of lantern light and noise. A fiddler was tuning his instrument in the corner, his bow scraping out discordant notes that grated on Ella's already frayed nerves. The room was packed, the air thick with the competing smells of baked goods, wood smoke, and damp wool. As they entered, a brief lull in the conversation rippled outward from the door. Every head turned. It was the stagecoach station all over again. They saw Martha Webb, a familiar and formidable presence. And then they saw the tall woman in the green dress beside her. The whispers started immediately, a sibilant rush of sound that made the hairs on the back of Ella's neck stand on end. She wanted to turn and flee, but Martha's hand, surprisingly strong, gripped her elbow. "Chin up," she muttered, steering her toward the long trestle table laden with food. "We're delivering a pie, not surrendering to an army." They deposited the pie among a dozen others. Martha was immediately absorbed into a conversation with the pastor's wife, leaving Ella standing alone at the edge of the room. She felt enormous, a clumsy giant in a world of normal-sized people. She clasped her hands in front of her, her knuckles white. She tried to look interested in a framed sampler on the wall, her eyes tracing the faded, crooked stitches of the alphabet. She watched the room from her post by the wall. She saw William Prescott standing with the store owner's daughters, the same girls who had mocked her. He was laughing at something one of them said, a shallow, reedy sound. He glanced in her direction, his smile faltering for a second before he quickly looked away, a faint flush rising on his neck. The sight of him no longer caused a sharp pain, only a dull, weary ache. The fiddler, joined now by a man with a guitar, struck up a lively reel. The floorboards vibrated as couples rushed to the center of the room, their boots stomping in time to the music. The room was a swirl of motion and color. Men led women, their hands placed confidently on their backs, guiding them through the steps. The women, laughing, followed. It was a dance of prescribed roles, of leader and follower, of tall and small. Ella watched, an observer from another world. She had resigned herself to a long evening of being a wallflower when the door opened again. Gabriel Blackwood stepped inside. He didn't make a grand entrance, but the room took note of him all the same. He was like Ella, an outsider of a different sort. The men from the logging camps nodded to him, a gesture of respect between men who understood hard, dangerous work. The townspeople watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He was a quiet, solitary man who kept to himself. His presence at a social event was an anomaly. He was dressed in clean, dark trousers and a plain white shirt. The sleeves rolled to his forearms. No jacket, no tie. He had made no concession to the formality of the evening beyond being clean. His eyes, dark and steady, swept the room. They passed over the dancers, the gossiping matrons, the preening young men. Then they found Ella, standing alone by the wall. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement across the crowded room. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and moved to lean against the back wall, opposite her. The reel ended in a flurry of laughter and applause. After a short pause, the musicians began a new tune. It was a waltz, slow and melodic. The floor filled again, the couples moving with more grace now, swirling to the gentle rhythm. Ella watched them, a familiar pang of longing in her chest. She had always loved to dance, but it had always been an awkward affair. She'd had to stoop to her partners, her back aching, her movements constrained, always trying to make herself smaller. She was so lost in the memory that she didn't see him cross the room. She only realized he was there when his large frame blocked her view of the dancers. "Miss Morgan," Gabriel Blackwood said. His voice was the same low rumble she was used to, but in the noisy hall, it seemed to create a small pocket of silence around them. She looked up at him. The room, which had been a loud, chaotic blur, suddenly sharpened into perfect focus. She was aware of everything, the way the lantern light caught the lines around his eyes, the smell of clean soap and pine that clung to him, the sudden, absolute quiet that had fallen over the people nearest to them. "Would you care to dance?" he asked. The question was a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples of shock spread through the hall. Conversations faltered. Dancers slowed their steps. Turning to look, William Prescott's jaw went slack. Martha Webb, a slice of pie halfway to her mouth, paused and a slow, knowing smile spread across her face. Ella's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to retreat to the safety of her wall. To dance with him would be to step onto a stage, to place herself willingly at the center of their collective gaze. But then she looked into his eyes. They were completely serious, completely steady. There was no mockery in them, no pity. It was a simple, direct question from one person to another. And in that moment, she was tired of being afraid. "Yes," she said, her voice a whisper she was afraid he wouldn't hear. "Yes, I would." He held out his hand. His palm was wide, his fingers long, the skin calloused from work. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and sure. He didn't pull her or rush her. He simply waited for her to be ready. And then he led her to an open space on the dance floor. He turned to face her, placing his other hand gently on the small of her back. She hesitantly placed her hand on his broad shoulder, and then she looked up to meet his eyes. And there was no up. For the first time in her entire life, she was looking directly into a dance partner's eyes. Not down at the top of his head, not at his forehead. Their gazes met on a perfectly even plane. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. A lifetime of stooping, of hunching, of trying to shrink herself, melted away. She felt her spine straighten, her shoulders relax. She stood at her full, true height, and he stood at his, and they were equal. He began to move, leading her into the slow, three-step rhythm of the waltz. Her feet, clumsy at first from shock and nerves, soon found the beat. He didn't lead with force, pushing her into the steps. It was more a suggestion, a subtle pressure from his hand, an anticipation of movement. He moved with a surprising, quiet grace for such a large man, and she found herself responding in kind. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. A different kind of conversation was taking place in the space between them. The whispers and stares from the edge of the floor faded into a meaningless buzz. The world shrank until it contained only the two of them, the simple, haunting melody of the fiddle and the steady, unwavering gaze they shared. She saw in his eyes a reflection of her own solitude, a quiet strength born of isolation, and she felt, for the first time, that she wasn't too much. She wasn't an error in proportion, a mistake of nature. She was simply a woman, dancing with a man. Her height, the very thing that had defined and shamed her, was, in this moment, irrelevant. Or rather, it was simply a fact, like the color of her eyes or the sound of her voice. They moved together, a seamless unit. They weren't turning to the rhythm of the fiddle anymore. They were turning to a deeper, unspoken rhythm they had found together, a rhythm of mutual understanding. They were two tall trees in a forest of smaller ones, and for the first time, instead of feeling out of place, she felt as if she had finally found her grove. When the last note of the waltz hung in the air and then faded to silence, they slowed to a stop. They didn't spring apart. For a long moment, they remained as they were, his hand on her back, hers on his shoulder, their eyes still locked. The silence of the room was different now. It was no longer the silence of shock or mockery. It was the silence of stunned, grudging respect. "Thank you, Miss Morgan," Gabriel said, his voice low. "For her alone." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice soft but steady. He escorted her back to her place by the wall, gave her a final, small nod, and then melted back into the shadows at the edge of the room. Ella leaned against the wall, her legs trembling slightly. She was alone again, but everything had changed. The room no longer felt hostile. The stairs seemed less pointed. She was still the giant seamstress, but now she was also the woman Gabriel Blackwood had crossed a crowded room to dance with, and that, she was beginning to realize, made all the difference. The waltz changed the air. It did not make Ella popular or beloved. but it altered the space she occupied in Silver Creek. The stares she received were now tinged with a grudging respect. The whispers held a note of speculation rather than mere mockery. She was no longer just the tall, rejected woman. She was the woman Gabriel Blackwood had danced with. Her quiet industry at the sewing table by the window was now seen not as a mark of her desperation, but as a sign of her dignity. A subtle shift had occurred, as quiet and profound as the turning of a season. Her interactions with Gabriel remained much the same on the surface, unspoken, existing in the spaces between words. A shared glance across the common room, a nod of acknowledgement as he left for the logging camps in the pre-dawn dark. Yet, an invisible thread now connected them. When he sat by the fire at night, the empty chair across from him felt less like a piece of furniture and more like an invitation. Sometimes she would take it, and they would sit in the comfortable silence she had come to cherish. The warmth of the stove a tangible presence between them. There was no courtship, no promises, only the quiet, steady building of something solid and real. One silent evening at a time. The snow began in earnest that December. It fell for days, a soft, relentless curtain of white that muffled the world and turned Silver Creek into an isolated outpost. The loggers, including Gabriel, were forced to stay in their camp high up the mountain, the trails back to town impassable. A week passed. Then, 10 days, the boarding house grew quiet without the boisterous energy of the woodsman. Ella's work continued, but she found her gaze drifting to the window often, her eyes tracing the endless dance of the falling flakes, a knot of unnamed apprehension tightening in her chest. The break in the weather came suddenly. The sky cleared to a brilliant, blinding blue, and the world was a pristine landscape of white. That afternoon, a few of the loggers made it down from the mountain, their faces grim and frost-nipped. They brought supplies and news. The work was hard, the snow deep, the trees treacherous with the weight of ice. Ella was hemming a heavy wool blanket for Martha when the door to the boarding house burst open, slamming against the interior wall with a crack like a rifle shot. A man stumbled in, not one of the boarders, but a young logger named Finn. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with panic. One of his arms was bound in a crude, blood-soaked sling, and he leaned heavily against the doorframe, his breath coming in ragged, steaming gasps. "Get the doc," he choked out, his voice raw. "It's Blackwood, a widowmaker, tree split. He shoved me clear." The common room, warm and peaceful moments before, was instantly plunged into a maelstrom of chaos. Martha dropped a stack of plates, the ceramic shattering on the floorboards. Men jumped up from the table, chairs scraping loudly. "What happened?" Santok Sense, one of the miners, demanded. But Ella heard none of it. Her world had gone silent, the blood roaring in her ears. The only words that registered were asterisk, Blackwood, asterisk, and asterisk, he shoved me clear, asterisk. The needle slipped from her numb fingers, falling unnoticed to the floor. Finn gasped for air. Leaning against the wall, the big pine on the ridge, it was rotten at the core. Came down wrong. A huge branch snapped off. Gabriel, his leg is crushed. Pinned him. We got him free. But it's bad. Real bad. He looked around the room, his panicked gaze landing on Ella, though it was unclear if he truly saw her. "We need the doctor. Now." Someone was already out the door, running through the deep snow toward the doctor's small house. But Ella knew, with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as an icicle in her heart, that it would not be enough. The logging camp was miles up the mountain. The trail was barely passable. By the time the elderly, frail doctor could make the journey, it could be too late. A torrent of voices swirled around her. "Crushed! You say, is he alive? God have mercy!" Ella stood up. Her movement was so sudden and decisive that the men nearest to her fell silent and took a step back. She felt preternaturally calm, a strange, cold clarity cutting through the panic. She saw not the chaos of the room, but a clear, straight path of action. "Martha," she said, her voice low but carrying over the din, I need the whiskey bottle from the pantry, and all the clean linen you can spare, and my heavy coat." Martha stared at her face pale, her usual composure shattered. "Ella, what are you thinking? You can't—" "I can," Ella said, her gaze unwavering. She was already moving, striding toward the staircase. She took the steps 2 at a time. In her room, she pulled on her thickest wool stockings and a second petticoat for warmth. She grabbed the heavy man's coat she had bought with her sewing money, a practical garment that reached her knees. She wrapped a thick woolen shawl around her head and neck, leaving only her eyes exposed. When she came back down, Martha was standing by the door with a canvas sack. Inside was the whiskey, a stack of clean linen torn into strips, and a small parcel of bread and dried meat. Their eyes met, and in Martha's expression, Ella saw not protest, but a grim, reluctant understanding. "The trail starts behind the livery," Martha said quietly. "Follow the blazed trees. It'll be drifted over. Be careful." "I will," Ella replied. She took the sack, slung it over her shoulder, and walked out the door, leaving the shocked silence of the common room behind her. The cold was a physical blow. The air was thin and sharp, searing her lungs with every breath. The pristine beauty of the snow was a lie. It was a treacherous, smothering enemy. The path Martha had described was barely visible, a faint depression in the sea of white. Snow was knee-deep, but she kept walking. Her long legs, so often a source of awkwardness, were now a blessing. She moved with a steady, relentless pace, her height allowing her to navigate drifts that would have swallowed a smaller person. The canvas sack bumped against her back, a reminder of her purpose. Her mind was empty of everything but the singular goal reaching him. No one had asked her to come. No one had led the way. There was only the driving, desperate beat of her own heart and the echo of a young man's panicked words, "His leg is crushed, *." She thought of their dance, of the quiet strength in his hands, the steady calm in his eyes. The thought of that strength being broken, that calm shattered by pain, was an agony that dwarfed the burning cold in her limbs. Her worry was a fire in her belly, propelling her forward, making her faster. The wind rose as she climbed higher, whipping across the exposed ridges, driving tiny pellets of ice into her face. The sun, bright and useless, offered no warmth. She lost the trail twice, floundering in waist-deep powder until she found the next blaze mark on a tree trunk. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs ached. But she did not stop. She did not even consider it. Her heart could no longer bear the distance. Every step was a prayer, every ragged breath a refusal to accept the possibility of a world without him in it. After what felt like an eternity, she smelled the wood smoke, a thin gray plume rising against the stark blue sky. Then she heard the sound of an axe, a desperate, frantic chopping. She broke through a line of snow-laden firs and saw the camp. It was a grim, makeshift affair, a few rough-hewn cabins, a lean-to for the horses, and a large, smoldering fire pit. A group of men were gathered near one of the cabins, their figures dark and hunched against the snow. They looked up as she approached, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. A woman, appearing as if from nowhere, out of the frozen wilderness. She ignored them. Her eyes scanned the scene, landing on the open door of the largest cabin. That was where he would be. She walked toward it, her boots crunching loudly in the sudden silence. She stepped inside. The cabin was dark and suffocatingly hot, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, pine, and blood. Several men were crowded inside, their faces pale and helpless in the flickering lantern light. And on a low bunk against the far wall lay Gabriel. He was covered with a pile of rough wool blankets, but one leg was exposed. It was a ruin of cloth and flesh, unnaturally twisted and held in place by crude splints. The snow around the bunk was stained a terrifying dark red. His face was chalk white beneath his dark beard, his skin slick with a cold sweat. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and labored. For a moment, Ella's heart stopped. The sight of him so broken, so utterly still, threatened to undo her. But then, a low moan escaped his lips, a sound of pure, animal pain, and it broke the spell. Her fear coalesced into a cold, hard resolve. She dropped the sack onto the floor. "Get me a bucket of the cleanest snow you can find," she said, her voice cutting through the thick, helpless silence. "And put a pot of it on the fire to boil. Now!" The men stared at her, momentarily stunned into inaction. She turned to the man nearest to her, a burly, bearded logger whose eyes were wide with shock. "Did the doctor send anything with you?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He shook his head dumbly. "Then move," she commanded, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative tone that no one had ever heard from her before. "Snow, hot water, and give me some room." As if released from a trance, the men scrambled to obey. Ella knelt beside the bunk. She gently pulled back the blanket. The air was frigid, but sweat beaded on her forehead. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she reached for the bottle of whiskey and a strip of clean linen. She had work to do. The world inside the small logging cabin shrank to the size of the narrow bunk where Gabriel Blackwood fought for his life. For 2 days and 2 nights, Ella did not leave his side. The storm raged outside, sealing them off from Silver Creek. But the true blizzard was the fever that consumed him. She moved with a focused, almost grim determination, a general commanding a desperate siege. The loggers, a group of rough, powerful men accustomed to bending nature to their will, were rendered helpless and awestruck. They watched as she cleaned the horrific wound with whiskey that made Gabriel cry out in his delirium, his body arching off the bunk. They watched as she used their strongest man to help her hold him down while she forced the shattered bones of his lower leg into a semblance of alignment. The sound of grating bone a sickening noise in the crowded cabin. Her face was a pale, set mask, but her hands were deft and sure. They followed her orders without question, keeping the fire roaring, melting endless buckets of snow, tearing their own spare shirts into bandages when she ran out of linen. On the 3rd day, the storm broke, and Dr. Adams arrived. He was a small, stooped man with hands gnarled by age, but his eyes were still sharp. He clomped into the cabin, took one look at the scene at Gabriel, pale but breathing steadily, at the clean bandages on his leg, at the exhausted but resolute woman sitting by his side, and gave a low whistle. He examined the leg, his touch surprisingly gentle. He listened to Gabriel's chest. He looked at the empty whiskey bottle. Finally, he turned his sharp eyes on Ella. "I'll be frank, miss," he said, his voice raspy. "I expected to be coming up here for a funeral, or an amputation at best. The fact that this boy is still breathing, and that his leg is still attached to his body with a chance of healing, is your doing. The whiskey, the clean linen, the splint, crude, but effective. You saved him." The doctor's words, a simple statement of professional fact, hung in the air. The loggers looked at Ella with a new kind of reverence. She was no longer just a woman who had appeared out of a storm. She was a force of nature in her own right. Gabriel was too weak to remain at the camp. A crude sled was constructed, and 4 of the strongest men, including the young logger Finn, whose life Gabriel had saved, carried him down the treacherous mountain trail. Ella walked beside the sled the entire way, her hand resting on the edge, as if her touch alone could ward off any further harm. They brought him not to his own small, cold cabin at the edge of town, but to the warmth and relative comfort of Martha Webb's boarding house. He was given the small, private room on the ground floor, a space usually reserved for travelers of means. The journey had taken its toll, and his fever returned with a vengeance. For the next week, he was lost to them, trapped in a gray world of pain and delirium, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. And every day, every hour, Ella was there. She gave up her corner in the common room. The mending basket lay untouched. Her life now revolved around the sick room. She bathed his feverish skin with cool water, spooned thin broth between his cracked lips, changed the dressings on his mangled leg, and listened to his pained, incoherent muttering. She slept in a chair by his bed, her senses attuned to every shift in his breathing, waking at his slightest moan. At first, the town saw her actions through the lens of the doctor's praise. She was a hero, the brave woman who had faced a blizzard and saved a man's life. Mrs. Peterson brought a hot meat pie to the boarding house. The gruff miners tipped their hats when she made a rare, quick trip to the general store for supplies. But Silver Creek was a small town, and heroism had a short memory. Propriety, however, was eternal. The whispers began as a low murmur. A question passed between two women over a fence line. "It's been over a week now. Is she still there?" Soon, the questions soured into insinuation. The story of her public rejection at the stagecoach station was resurrected and woven into this new narrative. She came here for one man and was turned away. The whispers went, "Now she's latched onto another, and him too helpless to say yea or nay. It's hardly proper." The fact that she was unmarried, a woman alone, living under the same roof as an unmarried man and tending to his most intimate needs, was a scandal too delicious for the town gossips to ignore. Her vigil was no longer seen as an act of selfless care, but as a brazen, calculated campaign. Ella felt the shift in the town's mood like a drop in barometric pressure. She saw it in the way Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, pursed her lips and gave her a curt, disapproving nod when they passed on the street. She heard it in the sudden silence that fell when she entered the general store, the conversations only resuming in hushed tones after she had moved to a different aisle. She was once again the spectacle, her every action scrutinized and judged. She gritted her teeth and endured. The sting of their judgment was real, a constant, dull ache of injustice. But the steady, fragile rhythm of Gabriel's breathing was more important. His life was the only thing that mattered. One afternoon, as Ella was changing the water in the basin by Gabriel's bed, Martha entered the room, her face set like granite. "Mrs. Gable is in the common room," she said, her voice low and tight. "She's come to inquire after Mr. Blackwood's spiritual welfare," which is her way of saying she's come to pass judgment on this house and everyone in it. Ella's hand tightened on the basin. "I'll go to my room." "You'll do no such thing," Martha snapped, her eyes flashing. "You'll stay right here. This is your post. I'll handle the pastor's wife." Ella could hear the murmur of voices from the other room. She couldn't make out the words, but she could imagine them. She stood by the window, her back to the door, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger. After a few minutes, she heard the sharp, decisive click of the front door closing. Martha reappeared, her cheeks flushed with anger. "I told her that Mr. Blackwood was a boarder in my house, and you were a resident in my house. And you were nursing him at my request because you have a steadier hand and more sense than any two other people in this town," Martha reported, her words clipped. "I also suggested that if she was so concerned with propriety, she was welcome to come take your place, changing his bandages and cleaning up after him." She declined. A small, watery smile touched Ella's lips. "Thank you, Martha." "Bah," Martha grunted, though her eyes were kind. "Decency ain't about following rules someone else made up. It's about showing up when you're needed. Now, you see that he gets this broth. He needs his strength." Martha's support was a shield, but it could not stop the whispers. They were a poison that seeped under the door and through the walls. Ella felt their weight every day, and her exhaustion grew. 2 weeks after the accident, the fever finally broke. Ella woke in her chair to find Gabriel watching her, his eyes clear and lucid for the first time. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, but the delirium was gone. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, rasping whisper. "Water." She was at his side in an instant, lifting his head and holding a cup to his lips. He drank greedily. "Ella," he rasped, his eyes holding hers. "You—" He coughed, the effort exhausting him. "Hush now," she said softly, smoothing the blanket over his chest. "Don't try to talk. Just rest. You need to rest." He was too weak to argue. He slept for most of the next few days, a deep, healing sleep. But now, when he was awake, he was aware. He watched her as she moved about the room, his dark eyes following her every motion. He didn't say much, his strength still at a low ebb, but the silence between them was different now. It was filled with a profound, unspoken gratitude that was more eloquent than any words. One evening, Ella returned to the room after a brief meal with Martha. She had been gone no more than 20 minutes. The room was quiet, and Gabriel appeared to be sleeping, his breathing even. She went to straighten his blankets, her movements gentle so as not to wake him. As she smoothed the pillow beside his head, her fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper. It was a page torn from a small ledger, the kind he might have used for his logging accounts. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp thump. With trembling fingers, she picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, the pencil strokes weak and uneven, but the words were clear. There were only 3 of them. Asterisk, keep standing tall. Ella sank into the chair, her legs suddenly weak. She stared at the note, reading the words over and over. He knew, somehow, through the fog of his pain and fever. He had understood. He had heard the whispers, felt the judgment that surrounded her, and he knew the price she was paying for being at his side. This small, simple message was his answer to it all. It was not a declaration of love, not a promise for the future. It was something quieter, and perhaps more profound. It was an acknowledgement of her strength, of the very quality the world saw as a flaw. He was telling her not to shrink, not to bow to their pressure. He was telling her that he saw her, truly saw her, and he was standing with her. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed for weeks pricked at the back of her eyes. She carefully refolded the piece of paper and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, a secret talisman against the world. She looked over at the sleeping man, his face peaceful in the lamplight, and a quiet, fierce strength bloomed in her chest. The whispers could continue. The town could judge. It no longer mattered. They were in this together. With Gabriel's return from the brink, a new, quieter rhythm established itself in the small ground-floor room. The desperate life-or-death struggle was replaced by the slow, tedious work of healing. He was still weak, his leg a prison of splints and bandages. But his mind was clear, and his quiet strength was returning, bit by bit. He could sit up against a pile of pillows for an hour at a time now, and the gruel Ella fed him had been replaced by the thick, savory stews Martha Webb cooked with restorative intent. Ella, in turn, reclaimed a small piece of her own life. With the immediate crisis past, she brought her mending basket into the sick room, while Gabriel slept or simply rested. She would sit in the chair by the window, the familiar motion of her needle a comforting counterpoint to the slow ticking of the clock. Her hands were never idle. If she wasn't tending to him, she was sewing. The small coins she earned a quiet declaration of her continued independence. They spoke little, but their silences were rich with unspoken understanding. He would watch her for long stretches, his dark eyes following the deft movement of her hands. She, in turn, was acutely aware of his presence, of the steady sound of his breathing that had become the background music of her life. The note he had written remained tucked in her pocket, a constant, warm pressure against her skin. It was on a crisp, cold afternoon, when the low sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, that their fragile peace was shattered. Ella was reading aloud to Gabriel from a worn copy of Shakespeare, a book she'd found on Martha's shelf, her voice low and even, when the sound of a sharp, insistent knock echoed from the front of the house. A few moments later, they heard Martha's voice, tight and unwelcoming. followed by a smoother, more cultured male tone that sent a jolt of ice through Ella's veins. She stopped reading, the book held stiffly in her hands. Gabriel's eyes, which had been closed in peaceful repose, opened and fixed on the door, a flicker of warning in their depths. The door to the room opened without a second knock. William Prescott stood on the threshold, holding a small basket of jellies and store-bought biscuits. He was dressed impeccably in a dark wool suit, his sandy hair perfectly combed, his face arranged in a mask of solemn concern. "Miss Morgan," he began, his voice oozing a practiced sympathy that made her skin crawl. "Forgive the intrusion. I was just passing and heard the dreadful news of Mr. Blackwood's accident. I felt it my duty as a concerned member of this community to see if there was anything you or he might require." His eyes swept the room, taking in the intimate domesticity of the scene, the neatly ordered medicine bottles on the washstand, the mending basket by her chair, the book lying open in her lap. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second too long on the way the blankets were tucked around Gabriel's broad shoulders. Martha Webb appeared behind him, her face a thundercloud. "Mr. Prescott, this is a sick room, not a public hall. Mr. Blackwood needs his rest." Of course, Mrs. Webb," William said smoothly, stepping fully into the room and placing the basket on a small table. "I only wish to pay my respects. It is a terrible thing, this, and to find you, Miss Morgan, in such trying circumstances." He turned the full force of his feigned pity on Ella. "It must be a great burden, after your own difficult arrival." He had managed, in one breath, to remind her of her public humiliation while framing himself as a benevolent gentleman. Ella felt a hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks, but she pressed it down, turning it into a cold, hard stone in her gut. She closed the book and placed it on her lap, her hands resting calmly on the cover. "That is kind of you, Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice perfectly even. "But as you can see, we are managing quite well." From the bed, Gabriel shifted slightly, a subtle movement of discomfort. He said nothing, but his eyes, narrowed and sharp, were fixed on William. He was a lion trapped, unable to physically defend his territory, but his gaze was a palpable warning. William ignored him, his focus entirely on Ella. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "Managing. Yes, you are clearly a most capable woman, but it is your reputation I am concerned for. Silver Creek is a small town, tongues are wagging. A single woman, spending day and night in a man's chambers. It is not a good look. People are beginning to talk." "Let them talk," Ella said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but losing none of its firmness. William let out a small, condescending laugh. "My dear Miss Morgan, you are perhaps too innocent of the ways of the world. A woman's reputation is all she has. I feel a certain responsibility for you, having been the instrument of your coming here. I would hate to see you make another unfortunate mistake." The patronage in his tone was suffocating. He was painting her as a naive fool, and himself as her worldly protector. Every word was a carefully placed barb, designed to remind her of her vulnerability, of her status as an outsider. He leaned in closer still, the scent of his bay rum cologne an unwelcome intrusion in the clean, simple air of the sick room. His voice was a venomous hiss disguised as a whisper. "You cannot truly believe this is a tenable situation. This man," he gestured dismissively toward the bed, "is a reclusive logger. He has nothing. What future do you imagine you have here, clinging to the bedside of an invalid?" Ella stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. She rose to her full height, until she was looking down at him. The book slid from her lap and landed with a soft thud on the floorboards, but she didn't notice. "My future, Mr. Prescott, is not a topic for your speculation," she said, her voice still quiet, but now laced with ice. His mask of concern finally slipped. A sneer, ugly and raw, twisted his lips. He had expected tears or a stammering defense. Her composure infuriated him. "Don't you understand?" he hissed, his voice rising. "You are a joke, a spectacle. First you arrive, a giantess expecting a wedding ring. Now you play nursemaid to a broken-down woodsman. Do you really think anyone here wants you?" The words, cruel and deliberately aimed, struck her with the force of a physical slap. They were the very essence of her deepest fear that she was unwanted, that her presence was a burden, an imposition. For a single, agonizing second, the floor seemed to fall away beneath her feet. The whispers, the stares, the rejection, it all coalesced in his sneering face. And then she felt the folded paper in her pocket. Asterisk keeps standing tall. The memory of Gabriel's shaky handwriting was an anchor in the storm of William's malice. She took a slow breath, and when she spoke, her voice was as clear and cold as the winter air outside. "Whether I am wanted, Mr. Prescott, is of no importance to me," she said, looking directly into his eyes, refusing to flinch. "I am here because I am needed. There is a difference I doubt you would ever understand." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult him. She simply stated a fact, a truth so profound and simple that it disarmed him completely. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had come armed for a battle of hysterics and shame. He had no defense against this quiet, unshakable dignity. From the bed, a low voice, rough with disuse but clear as a bell, cut through the tense silence. "You heard the lady. Prescott," Gabriel said. He had pushed himself up further on his elbows, his face pale but his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "She told you to leave." William flinched as if he had been struck. He looked from Ella's implacable face to Gabriel's hostile glare. The room, which he had intended to dominate, had turned against him. He was the intruder here, the unwanted one. He flushed a deep, mottled red. "I was only trying to help," he stammered, his bravado evaporating. He snatched his basket of jellies from the table, a ridiculous prop in his hasty retreat. "Clearly, my good intentions are not appreciated." He practically fled the room, nearly colliding with Martha, who was standing just outside the door, a grimly satisfied look on her face. The front door of the boarding house slammed shut behind him. Silence descended on the room once more, thick and heavy. Ella stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. The adrenaline from the confrontation slowly began to recede, leaving her feeling shaky and strangely light. She had not cried, she had not shouted, she had not apologized for her existence. She had simply stood her ground. Slowly, she bent down and picked up the fallen book. Her hands were trembling slightly. "Ella," Gabriel said, his voice soft now. She turned to look at him. He had slumped back against the pillows, the small exertion having cost him, but his eyes were filled with a fierce, protective pride. "Are you all right?" he asked. A slow smile, the first genuine smile she had felt in a long time, touched her lips. She walked back to her chair, sank into it, and opened the book. "I am," she said, her voice full of a newfound certainty. "I am quite all right." And she began to read, her voice stronger and clearer than before. The confrontation with William Prescott left a subtle but significant change in its wake. It had been a private victory, a quiet affirmation of Ella's own worth, but it had also solidified the bond between her and Gabriel. An unspoken alliance had been forged in that room. They were no longer just a patient and a nurse. They were partners in a quiet rebellion against the town's narrow judgments. As the days grew shorter and the snow piled deeper against the windows, Gabriel's strength slowly returned. He could now sit in the armchair by the fire for most of the afternoon, his splinted leg propped on a stool. It was in that chair that he heard the news that brought the first flush of angry color back to his face. Finn, the young logger, brought it. He came stomping into the boarding house, his face grim, and asked to speak with Gabriel. He carried a rolled-up surveyor's map under his arm. "It's Prescott," Finn said, his voice low and furious as he unrolled the map on the table. "He's been meeting with the town council. He's got investors from back east. He wants to bring a railroad spur up the valley." Martha, who had been listening from the kitchen, came into the room, wiping her hands on her apron. "A railroad. That's fool's talk. Where would they put it?" Finn jabbed a finger at the map, at the familiar topography of the mountains that loomed over the town. "Right up the North Ridge. He wants to clear-cut the whole slope to make way for it. Says it'll bring a fortune to Silver Creek. Cheaper to get lumber out, cheaper to bring goods in." Gabriel leaned forward, his eyes scanning the lines on the map. Ella, standing behind his chair, saw his hands clench into fists on the arms of the chair. The North Ridge, the very place where the rotten pine had fallen, the place where he had almost died. "He can't," Gabriel said, his voice a low growl. "That entire slope is unstable. The old growth, the deep root systems, that's all that holds it together. If he clear-cuts that ridge, the first big spring melt will bring half the mountain down on this town. It's not just foolish, it's suicide." "We told him that," Finn said, throwing his hands up in frustration. "A few of us went to the first meeting. He called us sentimental old fools, said we were standing in the way of progress. He's got half the merchants in his pocket, promising them riches. He's calling a formal town meeting for Friday night to vote on the timber rights. Says it's a foregone conclusion." A deep, frustrated anger radiated from Gabriel. He was a man of action, a man whose knowledge was written not on maps, but on his own calloused hands. He knew the moods of the mountain, the language of the trees, and he was trapped in a chair, his body a prison, while a man he despised prepared to disembowel the very land that sustained them all. "I have to be there," Gabriel said, his jaw tight. "Gabriel, you can't even walk to the door," Martha said gently. "Then someone has to speak for me," he insisted, his eyes blazing. "Someone has to tell them the truth." He tried to push himself up, a wave of pain and dizziness washing over him, and he sank back into the chair, his face pale with the effort. The physical reminder of his own helplessness was a bitter pill. For the next 2 days, the boarding house was thick with tension. Gabriel was consumed with a restless, impotent fury. He tried to write down his arguments, scribbling on sheets of paper with a shaking hand, but the words on the page felt thin and lifeless compared to the conviction in his voice. He knew what needed to be said, but he couldn't be the one to say it. The other loggers were good, honest men, but they were not speakers. They were easily flustered by Prescott's smooth, condescending rhetoric. On the afternoon of the meeting, Gabriel fell into a frustrated silence, staring into the fire. Ella sat across from him, her mending lying forgotten in her lap. She saw the despair in his eyes, and it resonated with a deep, familiar ache inside her. She knew what it felt like to be silenced, to be dismissed, to have your worth judged and found wanting by a man like William Prescott. She saw it then with a sudden, startling clarity. This wasn't just about trees. This was about a way of life, a way of seeing the world. Prescott's progress was a force that flattened everything in its path, every inconvenient truth, every dissenting voice, every person who didn't fit his narrow vision of the world. He had tried to flatten her. Now he was trying to flatten a mountain. The fight was one and the same. "I'll go," she said, the words coming out before she had fully formed the thought. Gabriel looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Ella, you don't have to—" "I know," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I will." "You can tell me what needs to be said about the trees. The rest I already know." The church hall was even more crowded than it had been for the social. It was stiflingly hot, the air heavy with the smell of wet wool and simmering animosity. The town was visibly divided. On one side sat William Prescott, flanked by the store owners and other merchants, their faces confident and smug. On the other side were the loggers, the miners, and the older families of the town, their expressions a mixture of anger and apprehension. Ella and Martha took seats near the back, In the shadows, Prescott stood at the front, next to a large, professionally drawn map of his proposed railroad. He was in his element, his voice smooth and persuasive. He spoke of prosperity, of the future, of Silver Creek taking its rightful place as a hub of commerce. He painted a glorious picture of a bustling town, its fortunes secured for generations. "I know there are some among you," he said, his tone dripping with false magnanimity, "who are attached to the old ways, who look at these grand old trees and feel a certain sentimentality. I respect that, but we cannot let sentiment stand in the way of our children's future. Progress requires vision. It requires bold action. It requires us to clear away the old to make way for the new." He answered a few soft questions from his supporters. When one of the older loggers, a man named Silas, stood up and tried to speak about the danger of mudslides, Prescott cut him off with a condescending smile. "Thank you, Silas. Your practical experience is, of course, valued. But we will have engineers, experts from the East, who will ensure everything is perfectly safe. This is a matter of modern science, not old superstition." Silas sat down, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He had been dismissed, his lifetime of knowledge cast aside as irrelevant. It was clear Prescott had already won over the town council. The vote would be a mere formality. The chairman, a man who owned the freight company, was about to call the question. In the back of the room, Ella felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She looked at the faces of the loggers, at their frustration and their defeat. She looked at Prescott, so confident in his power, and she thought of Gabriel, trapped in his chair, his voice silenced. She thought of herself, standing alone at the stagecoach station, dismissed and discarded. The chairman opened his mouth to call the vote, and Ella stood up. Her rising was not a dramatic gesture, but in the crowded room, it had a dramatic effect. She was a landmark. A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall as every head turned to face her. "What's she doing?" a woman whispered behind her. Prescott's smile tightened, a flash of annoyance in his eyes. "Mr. Chairman," Ella said, her voice trembling slightly at first, "may I speak?" The chairman, flustered by this unexpected interruption, hesitated. But Martha Webb, from her seat beside Ella, said in a voice that carried through the entire hall, "This is a town meeting. Let the woman speak." A few of the loggers grunted their assent. "Trapped." The chairman nodded reluctantly. "You have the floor, Miss Morgan." Ella took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She did not move to the front of the room. She stood where she was, a tall, solitary figure in the back. "I am not from Silver Creek," she began, her voice growing stronger. "Steadier. I have no land here. I have no business, except what I can manage with a needle and thread. Many of you see me as an outsider, and you are right to do so. I do not know this town the way you do." She paused, letting the words sink in. She had disarmed them with her honesty. "But I have spent the last few months listening. I have listened to the men who work in the forest, Mr. Prescott wishes to clear. They have told me that the North Ridge is not just a collection of trees waiting to be turned into profit. They speak of it as a living thing. They know the way the roots of the old-growth pine hold the soil in place. They know that what happens on that ridge affects the entire valley. They say that to clear-cut that slope is to invite the mountain to fall upon your heads. Mr. Prescott calls this superstition. I have come to believe it is wisdom." She looked directly at Prescott, her gaze clear and unwavering. "Mr. Prescott speaks of progress and prosperity. These are tempting words, but I have learned that one must be cautious of men who speak the smoothest. True progress is not about clearing away everything that is old or inconvenient. It is about building on the strength of what is already there." Her voice grew in power, filled with a conviction born of her own experience. There are some men who look at the world and see only what can be used, or what is in their way. They look at a tall, ancient tree, or a winding, difficult path, or or a person who does not fit their narrow expectations. And their only thought is to cut it down, to straighten it out, to cast it aside. They seek to make everything flat and simple and profitable for themselves. The hall was utterly silent. Every person in the room knew she was no longer just talking about trees. "But the strength of this mountain is in its tall trees," she declared, her voice ringing with passion. "The beauty of a river is in its winding path, and the soul of a town is not in its future profits. It is in its people, all of its people, the ones who speak loudly, and the ones who speak quietly, the ones who fit in, and the ones who stand apart." She let her gaze sweep across the faces of the townspeople, the loggers, the merchants, and finally, back to William Prescott, who stared at her, his face pale with fury. "Before you vote to clear away that forest for a quick profit," she concluded, her voice dropping to a powerful, resonant hush, "ask yourselves what else you might be clearing away with it. Ask yourselves whose voices you are silencing to make way for the sound of money, and ask yourselves if the future you are buying is worth the soul you are selling." She said nothing more. She simply sat down, her heart pounding in her ears. The silence in the hall was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of stunned contemplation. She had not won them love or friendship. She had not erased their gossip or their judgment. But in that moment, she had done something far more important. She had won her voice, and the town of Silver Creek had been forced to listen. The silence that followed Ella's final word was a physical thing, more profound and absolute than the hush that had fallen when she first stood. In that quiet, the town of Silver Creek seemed to hold its collective breath. William Prescott's face was a mask of disbelief, slowly hardening into contemptuous rage. He had been defeated, not by a logical argument he could refute, but by a simple, unassailable truth that had resonated in the hearts of the very people he sought to manipulate. The town chairman, a portly man named Henderson, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the still hall. He looked from Ella's calm, seated form to Prescott's furious one, his own confidence visibly shaken. He was a man accustomed to following the path of least resistance, and that path had suddenly, irrevocably forked. The motion is on the floor," Henderson stammered, his eyes darting around the room, no longer meeting Prescott's gaze. "To grant exclusive timber rights for the Northridge to Mr. Prescott's consortium. All in favor." Prescott and his supporters, the merchants, the freight owner. The ambitious younger men raised their hands. It was a solid block of votes, but it was not the overwhelming majority he had expected. A flicker of anxiety crossed Prescott's face. "All opposed," Henderson said, his voice a little stronger now. A single hand went up immediately, belonging to Silas. The old logger Prescott had humiliated. Then another, and another. Finn, the young man whose life Gabriel had saved, raised his hand high, his eyes fixed on Ella with a look of fierce loyalty. Soon, nearly all the loggers and miners had their hands in the air. And then, a new thing happened. Mrs. Peterson, the miner's wife whose dress Ella had altered, slowly raised her hand. Her husband, sitting beside her, followed suit. A few other women who had brought their mending to Ella's table, who had experienced her quiet competence firsthand, raised their hands as well. They were not voting against a railroad. They were voting for the woman who had spoken a truth they recognized. The opposition was no longer just a faction. It was a force. Henderson counted, his lips moving silently. He recounted. A slow, stunned look of disbelief spread across his face. "The motion is defeated," he announced, his voice barely a whisper. Then, louder, as if to convince himself, "The motion is defeated." For a moment, there was no cheer, only a collective, rustling exhalation of breath. The victory was too sudden, too unexpected, for celebration. Prescott stood frozen, his face ashen. The plan he had nurtured for months, the future he had so confidently laid out, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. brought down by the words of a woman he had deemed utterly insignificant. He turned, his eyes locking on Ella. The hatred in his gaze was a raw, physical force. "You have made a grave mistake," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "All of you. You will regret this day. This town will rot in its own backward sentimentality." He snatched his coat and map and stormed out of the hall, slamming the door so hard that a pane of glass in the window rattled. His departure broke the spell. A low buzz of conversation started, then grew louder. The loggers gathered around Silas, clapping him on the back, their faces alight with a kind of bewildered joy. Ella remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, the storm of emotion inside her slowly beginning to subside. Martha Webb placed a firm, warm hand on her shoulder. "Come, child," she said, her voice thick with pride. "Let's go home. There's someone who will want to hear the news." The walk back to the boarding house was surreal. The world was the same. The snow on the ground was just as deep, the air just as cold, but something had fundamentally shifted. People who had pointedly ignored her for weeks now nodded as she passed. The looks she received were no longer of pity or mockery. They were filled with a new, complex mixture of awe, respect, and a deep, unsettling curiosity. She was no longer invisible. Finn had run ahead of them. When Ella and Martha entered the warm common room, they found him standing before Gabriel's chair, recounting the events of the meeting with breathless excitement. Gabriel was leaning forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his face a study in rapt attention. When he saw Ella enter, he stopped Finn mid-sentence. His eyes found hers across the room, and in their dark depths, she saw a universe of emotion, gratitude, pride, and something deeper, something she did not yet have a name for. He didn't need to say a word. In that single, shared glance, everything was understood. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet, incremental change. William Prescott, his pride and his plans in tatters, left Silver Creek on the next stagecoach east. His departure, as unlamented as his arrival, had been celebrated by a few. The threat of the railroad was gone, and the town settled back into its familiar rhythms. But the undercurrents had changed. Ella went back to her sewing table by the window. Her pile of mending was larger than ever. She still walked through town, and she was still stared at. She would always be stared at. Her height was a fact of nature that would not change. But the quality of the stares was different. The sharp edges of judgment had been worn smooth, replaced by a sort of hesitant reverence. One morning, as she was leaving the general store, a small boy, the same one who had once loudly pointed out her size, hid behind his mother's skirts as she passed. But this time, he peeked out, and with a shy, gap-toothed smile, he gave a tiny wave. His mother, who in the past would have shushed him and hurried him away, simply smiled and nodded at Ella, surprised and deeply touched. Ella smiled back and waved. Another afternoon, there was a soft knock on the boarding house door. It was old Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, the very woman who had come to pass judgment on Ella's presence in Gabriel's sick room. She stood on the porch, clutching a covered dish. "This is for Mr. Blackwood," she said, her gaze fixed somewhere near Ella's chin. "A chicken pudding, for his strength." She hesitated, then pushed the dish into Ella's hands. "And for you, my dear, what you did at the meeting. It was a sermon in itself, a very brave thing." And with that, she turned and scurried away, as if embarrassed by her own show of warmth. The loggers and miners no longer mumbled when they brought their torn clothes to her. They looked her in the eye and called her Miss Morgan. They spoke to her with a gruff, easy respect. They would sometimes linger, telling her a story about their day, asking her opinion on the weather. They were talking to her asterisk, not just to the seamstress. She was no longer the giant seamstress, the object of pity and scorn. In the town's collective mind, her identity had been reforged. She was now inextricably linked with Gabriel Blackwood. They were the ones who had saved the North Ridge. They had stood up to the smooth-talking man from the East and won. She was the voice, and he was the reason. She had earned her place, not by shrinking to fit their world, but by forcing them to make their world a little bigger. As Gabriel's leg healed, Dr. Adams finally gave his permission for the splints to be replaced by a heavy crutch. His confinement to the ground floor room came to an end. He did not return to his solitary cabin. He moved into one of the empty boarders' rooms upstairs, his presence becoming a permanent, comforting fixture in the house. Every evening, he would make his way slowly down the stairs and take his place in the armchair by the fire, and every evening, Ella would finish her work and take the seat opposite him. Their quiet companionship deepened, settling into a comfortable, domestic routine. They would talk sometimes, about books, about the news Finn brought from the logging camps, about the changing seasons, but mostly, they would sit in the shared, peaceful silence that had been the foundation of their bond from the very beginning. The victory at the town hall had not been a sudden, magical solution to all her problems, but it had been a turning point. It had given her a foothold in a world that had tried to cast her out. She had found her voice, and in doing so, had discovered that she was not just a woman who was too tall. She was a woman of substance, of strength, and of worth. And, as she sat by the fire, mending a logger's torn shirt while the man who believed in her sat quietly across from her, she knew, with a certainty that warmed her to her very soul, that it was more than enough. Spring arrived in Silver Creek not as a gentle thaw, but as a slow, muddy retreat of winter. The colossal drifts of snow that had buried the town for months began to shrink, weeping meltwater into the streets and turning the packed earth into a thick, greedy mire. The air, however, still held a knife's edge of cold, especially at night, and the great cast-iron stove in Martha Webb's common room remained the warm, beating heart of the house. Gabriel's leg was healing. The angry, broken flesh had become a roadmap of livid scars, and he had graduated from a crutch to a sturdy, hand-carved cane. The limp was pronounced, and Dr. Adams said it would likely be with him for life, a permanent reminder of the mountain's unforgiving nature. But he was walking. He had begun taking short, deliberate trips to the livery to check on his horse, or to the general store for Martha. Each journey was a small, hard-won victory. Ella's life, too, had found a new, settled rhythm. Her sewing table was a permanent fixture by the window, a recognized landmark in the town. She was no longer just a resident of the boarding house. She was part of its fabric. Her days were a quiet tapestry of work, punctuated by the steady, comforting presence of Gabriel. Their companionship was the silent, solid center around which her new world turned. They were two tall, quiet figures who had found in each other's presence a kind of gravity, a place to be still. Yet, there were moments, usually late at night after the other boarders had retired and the house had fallen silent, when a familiar old ache would surface in Ella's chest. It was the loneliness of a lifetime, a feeling so deeply ingrained it was part of her marrow. She had respect now. She had a purpose. She had a place. But she watched the families in town. The easy way a husband would take his wife's arm, the shared, knowing glances between people who belonged to each other. And she felt the vast, empty space that still surrounded her own heart. One such evening, she sat by the fire, the last of her mending folded neatly in the basket at her feet. Gabriel was across from her in his usual chair, his injured leg propped on a stool. His head leaned back, eyes closed. The only sounds were the soft hiss and pop of the logs in the stove and the sighing of the wind around the corners of the house. She had spent the afternoon altering a wedding dress for Sarah Peterson's younger sister. The delicate lace and fine white silk felt foreign and strange in her large, capable hands. As she worked, she'd felt the familiar pang, the knowledge that such a garment, such a ceremony, such a belonging, was a thing for other women. Women who were not too much, too tall, too different. The feeling had lingered. a low, melancholic hum beneath the surface of her quiet contentment. She looked at Gabriel, so peaceful in his repose, and a wave of sadness washed over her. He was her friend, her staunchest ally. He had faced down the town's scorn with her. But what were they, truly, two solitary souls who had found a temporary harbor in the same storm? What would happen when his leg was fully healed, when he was ready to return to the mountains, to the solitary life he had known before? The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. She stared into the mesmerizing orange and gold heart of the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's a funny thing," she said, her voice so soft it was little more than a whisper, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "You can be in a room full of people who know your name, who even respect you, I suppose, and you can still feel entirely alone." Gabriel's eyes opened. He didn't speak, just watched her, his gaze steady and serious in the flickering firelight. A single, hot tear welled in her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. She hastily wiped it away with the back of her hand, angry at her own weakness. "All the nods and the pies and the kind words," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. "They're for the woman who spoke at the meeting, for the woman who saved your leg. They're transactions, a payment for services rendered. It's not the same." She took a shaky breath, the truth of a lifetime finally spilling out in a raw, painful whisper. "No one truly cares for me, not for the person I am, just for what I can do." The words hung in the warm, silent air between them, fragile and terribly sad. She expected him to offer a denial, a comforting platitude. "That's not true. Ella, of course they care." But he said nothing. He simply held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with a soft grunt of effort, he leaned forward. His movements were slow, deliberate. He reached down and began to unlace his heavy leather boot, the one on his good foot. The leather creaked as he worked the laces free. He pulled it off and set it on the stone hearth with a soft, solid thud. Then he leaned over, his face tight with the strain of the awkward angle, and unlaced the other, carefully maneuvering it off over the scarred, misshapen ankle of his injured leg. He placed it neatly beside its mate. The simple, domestic act was so unexpected, so deeply familiar, that Ella watched, mesmerized, her own sorrow momentarily forgotten. It was the same thing he had done on that first, terrible night. He had taken off his boots, setting aside the outside world to enter a space of quiet and warmth. He pushed himself up out of his chair, using his cane for support. He did not go to the stairs. He did not retreat to his own room. Instead, he limped the few steps that separated their chairs and lowered himself onto the thick sheepskin rug at her feet, his back resting against the side of her armchair. He was so close she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the faint, clean scent of pine and soap that always clung to him. He reached over and picked up a thick wool blanket that was folded on a nearby chest. He shook it out and gently, carefully, draped it over her shoulders and his own, creating a small, shared tent of warmth. And then he just sat there, his shoulder pressing lightly against her knee. He stared into the fire, his profile strong and quiet in the glowing light. The silence stretched, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty, it was filled with the weight of his actions, with the solid, undeniable fact of his presence beside her. He had heard her deepest, most painful truth, and he had not run, he had not offered empty words. He had moved closer. After a long time, when the log in the stove shifted and sent a shower of bright orange sparks up the flue, he finally spoke, his voice a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. "Not everyone knows how to care. Ella," he said, his eyes still fixed on the flames. "Some of us, we're not practiced in it. We spend too much time alone. The words don't come easy." He paused, and she held her breath, waiting. He turned his head then and looked up at her. The firelight was reflected in his dark, serious eyes, and in their depths, she saw a raw, breathtaking honesty. "But I'm learning," he said. The words were a quiet promise, more powerful than any grand declaration. It was not a statement of a feeling already perfected, but a commitment to a journey. He was learning. For her. The tightness in Ella's chest, the cold knot of a lifetime of loneliness, did not shatter. It simply dissolved. It melted away in the gentle, steady warmth of his presence, in the profound, simple truth of his words. There was no kiss. There was no talk of marriage or a future built of rings and vows. There was only this moment, a man and a woman, sitting together in the firelight, wrapped in the same blanket, shielded from the cold and the loneliness of the world. And as Ella looked down at him, at this quiet, solid man who had seen her at her most broken and her most fierce, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that it was enough. It was more than enough. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you. Please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like. And if you enjoyed the tale, consider hitting the hype button to help it reach more listeners.